Chapter 9, The Making of the National Movement, 1870s to 1947. In the previous chapters, we have looked at the British conquest of territories and takeover of kingdoms, introduction of new laws and administrative institutions, changes in the lives of peasants and tribals, educational changes in the 19th century, debates regarding the condition of women, challenges to the caste system, social and religious reform, the revolt of 1857 and its aftermath, the decline of crafts and growth of industries. On the basis of what you have read about these issues, do you think Indians were discontented with British rule? If so, how were different groups and classes dissatisfied? The emergence of nationalism. The above mentioned developments led the people to ask a crucial question: what is this country of India and for whom is it meant? The answer that gradually emerged was: India was the people of India, all the people irrespective of class, color, caste, creed, language or gender, and the country, its resources and systems were meant for all of them. With this answer came the awareness that the British were exercising control over the resources of India and the lives of its people, and until this control was ended, India could not be for Indians. This consciousness began to be clearly stated by the political associations formed after 1850, especially those that came into being in the 1870s and 1880s. Most of these were led by English-educated professionals such as lawyers. The more important ones were the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, the Indian Association, the Madras Mahajan Sabha, the Bombay Presidency Association, and of course the Indian National Congress. Note the name Pune Sarvajanik Sabha. The literal meaning of Sarvajanik is of or for all the people. Sarva is equal to all plus Janik is equal to of the people. Through many of these associations functions in specific parts of the country, their goals were stated as the goals of all the people of India, not those of any one region, community or class. They worked with the idea that the people should be sovereign, a modern consciousness and a key feature of nationalism. In other words, they believed that the Indian people should be empowered to take decisions regarding their affairs. The dissatisfaction with British rule intensified in the 1870s-1880s. The Arms Act was passed in 1878. Same year, the Vernacular Press Act was also enacted, in an effect to silence those who were critical of the government. The act allowed the government to confiscate the assets of newspapers, including their printing presses, if the newspapers published anything that was found objectionable. In 1883, there was a furor over the attempt by the government to introduce the Albert Bill. The bill provided for the trial of British or European persons by Indians and sought equality between British and Indian judges in the country. But when white opposition forced the government to withdraw the bill, Indians were enraged. The event highlighted the racial attitudes of the British in India. The need for an all-India organization of educated Indians had been felt since 1880, but the Albert Bill controversy deepened this desire. The Indian National Congress was established when 72 delegates from all over the country met at Bombay in December 1885. The early leadership, Dadabhai Nauroji, Firoz Shah Mehta, Badruddin Tyabji, W.C. Banerjee, Surendranath Banerjee, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, S. Subramania Iyer, among others, was largely from Bombay and Calcutta. Nauroji, a businessman and publicist, settled in London and for a time member of the British Parliament, guided the younger nationalists. A retired British official, A.O. Hume, also played a part in bringing Indians from the various regions together. A nation in the making. It has often been said that the Congress in the first 20 years was moderate in its objectives and methods. During this period, it demanded a greater voice for Indians in the government and in administration. It wanted the legislative councils to be made more representative, given more power, and introduced in provinces where none existed. It demanded that Indians be placed in high positions in the government. For this purpose, it called for civil service examination to be held in India as well, not just in London. The demand for Indianization of the administration was part of a movement against racism, since most important jobs at the time were monopolized by Indian White officials and the British generally assumed that Indians could not be given positions of responsibility. Since British officers were sending a major part of their large salaries home, Indianization, it was hoped, would also reduce the drain of wealth to England. Other demands included the separation of the judiciary from the executive, the repeal of the Arms Act, and the freedom of speech and expression. The early Congress also raised a number of economic issues. It declared that British rule had led to poverty and famines. Increase in the land revenue had empowered peasants and zamindars, and exports of grains to Europe had created food shortages. The Congress demanded reduction of revenue, cut in military expenditure, and more funds for irrigation. It passed many resolutions on the salt tax, treatment of Indian laborers abroad, and the sufferings of forest dwellers caused by an interfering forest administration. All this shows that despite being a body of the educated elite, the Congress did not talk only on behalf of professional groups, zamindars, or industrialists. The moderate leaders wanted to develop public awareness about the unjust nature of British rule. They published newspapers, wrote articles, and showed how British rule was leading to the economic ruin of the country. They criticized British rule in their speeches and sent representatives to different parts of the country to mobilize public opinion. They felt that the British had respect for the ideals of freedom and justice, and so they would accept the just demands of Indians. What was necessary, therefore, was to express these demands and make the government aware of the feelings of Indians. Freedom is our birthright. By the 1890s, many Indians began to raise questions about the political style of the Congress. In Bengal, Maharashtra, and Punjab, leaders such as Bipin Chandra Pal, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Lala Lajpat Rai were beginning to explore more radical objectives and methods. They criticized the moderates for their politics of prayers and emphasized the importance of self-reliance and constructive work. They argued that people must rely on their own strength, not on the good intentions of the government. People must fight for Swaraj. Tilak raised the slogan, "Freedom is my birthright and I shall have it." In 1905, Viceroy Curzon partitioned Bengal. At that time, Bengal was the biggest province of British India and included Bihar and parts of Odisha. The British argued for dividing Bengal for reasons of administrative convenience. But what did administrative convenience mean? Whose convenience did it represent? Clearly, it was closely tied to the interest of British officials and businessmen. Even so, instead of removing the non-Bengali areas from the province, the government separated East Bengal and merged it with Assam. Perhaps the main British motives were to curtail the influence of Bengal politicians and to split the Bengal people. The partition of Bengal infuriated people all over India. All sections of the Congress, the moderates and the radicals as they may be called, opposed it. Large public meetings and demonstrations were organized and novel methods of mass protest developed. The struggle that unfolded came to be known as the Swadeshi movement, strongest in Bengal but with echoes elsewhere too. In deltaic Andhra, for instance, it was known as the Vande Mataram movement. The Swadeshi movement sought to oppose British rule and encourage the ideas of self-help, Swadeshi enterprise, national education, and use of Indian languages to fight for Swaraj. The radicals advocated mass mobilization and boycott of British institutions and goods. Some individuals also began to suggest that revolutionary violence would be necessary to overthrow British rule. The opening decades of the 20th century were marked by other developments. A group of Muslim landlords and Nawabs formed the All India Muslim League at Dhaka in 1906. The League supported the partition of Bengal. It desired separate electorates for Muslims, a demand considered by the government in 1909. Some seats in the councils were now reserved for Muslims who would be elected by Muslim voters. This tempted politicians to gather a following by distributing favors to their own religious group. Meanwhile, the Congress split in 1907. The moderates were opposed to the use of boycott. They felt that it involved the use of force. After the split of Congress came to be dominated by the moderates, with Tilak's followers functioning from outside. The two groups reunited to December 1915. Next year, the Congress and the Muslim League signed the historic Lucknow Pact and decided to work together for representative government in the country. The growth of mass nationalism. After 1919, the struggle against British rule gradually became a mass movement involving peasants, tribals, students, and women in large numbers, and occasionally factory workers as well. Certain business groups too began to actively support the Congress in the 1920s. Why was this so? The First World War altered the economic and political situation in India. It led to a huge rise in the defense expenditure of the Government of India. The government in turn increased taxes on individual incomes and business profits. Increased military expenditure and the demands for war supplies led to a sharp rise in price, which created great difficulties for the common people. On the other hand, business groups reaped fabulous profits from the war. As you have seen, Chapter 7, the war created a demand for industrial goods, jute bags, cloth, rails, and caused a decline of imports from the other country into India. So Indian industries expanded during the war and Indian business groups began to demand greater opportunities for development. The war also led the British to expand their army. Villages were pressurized to supply soldiers for an alien cause. A large number of soldiers were sent to serve abroad. Many returned after the war with an understanding of the ways in which imperialist powers were exploiting the peoples of Asia and Africa, and with a desire to oppose colonial rule in India. Furthermore, in 1917, there was a revolution in Russia. News about peasants and workers' struggles and ideas of socialism circulated widely, inspiring Indian nationalists. The advent of Mahatma Gandhi. It is in these circumstances that Mahatma Gandhi emerged as a mass leader. As you may know, Gandhiji, aged 46, arrived in India in 1915 from South Africa, having led Indians in that country in non-violent marches against racist restrictions. He was already a respected leader known internationally. His South African campaigns had brought him in contact with various types of Indians: Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, and Christians, Gujaratis, Tamils, and North Indians, and upper-class merchants, lawyers, and workers. Mahatma Gandhi spent his first year in India traveling throughout the country, understanding the people, their needs, and the overall situation. His earliest interventions were in local movements in Champaran, Kheda, and Ahmedabad, where he came into contact with Rajendra Prasad and Vallabhbhai Patel. In Ahmedabad, he led a successful mill workers' strike in 1918. Let us now focus in some detail on the movements organized between 1919 to 1922. The Rowlatt Satyagraha. In 1919, Gandhiji gave a call for a satyagraha against the Rowlatt Act that the British had just passed. The act curbed fundamental rights such as the freedom of expression and strengthened police powers. Mahatma Gandhi, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and others felt that the government had no right to restrict people's basic freedoms. They criticized the act as devilish and tyrannical. Gandhiji asked the Indian people to observe 6 April 1919 as a day of non-violent opposition to this act, as a day of humiliation and prayer, and Hartal, strike, Satyagraha Sabhas were set up to launch the movement. The Rowlatt Satyagraha turned out to be the first all-Indian struggle against the British government. Although it was largely restricted to cities, in April 1919 there were a number of demonstrations and Hartals in the country, and the government used brutal measures to suppress them. The Jallianwala Bagh atrocities inflicted by General Dyer in Amritsar on Baisakhi Day, 13 April, were a part of this repression. On learning about the massacre, Rabindranath Tagore expressed the pain and anger of the country by renouncing his knighthood. During the Rowlatt Satyagraha, the participants tried to ensure that Hindus and Muslims were united in the fight against British rule. This was also the call of Mahatma Gandhi, who always saw India as a land of all the people who lived in the country. Hindus, Muslims and those of other religions. He was keen that Hindus and Muslims support each other in any just cause. Khilafat agitation and the non-cooperation movement. The Khilafat issue was one such cause. In 1920, the British imposed a harsh treaty on the Turkish Sultan or Khalifa. People were furious about this as they had been about the Jallianwala massacre. Also, Indian Muslims were keen that the Khalifa be allowed to retain control over Muslim sacred places in the erstwhile Ottoman Empire. The leaders of the Khilafat agitation, Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali, now wished to initiate a full-fledged non-cooperation movement. Gandhiji supported their call and urged the Congress to campaign against Punjab wrongs, Jallianwala massacre, the Khilafat wrong and demand Swaraj. The non-cooperation movement gained momentum through 1921 to 22. Thousands of students left government-controlled schools and colleges. Many lawyers such as Motilal Nehru, C.R. Das, C. Rajgopalachari and Asaf Ali gave up their practices. British titles were surrendered and legislatures boycotted. People lit public bonfire of foreign cloth. The imports of foreign cloth fell drastically between 1920 and 1922. But all this was merely the tip of the iceberg. Large part of the country were on the brink of formidable revolt. People's initiatives. In many cases, people resisted British rule non-violently. In other, different classes and groups interpreting Gandhi's call in their own manner protested in ways that were not in accordance with his ideas. In either case, people linked their movements to local grievance. Let us look at a few examples. In Kheda, Gujarat, Patidar peasants organized non-violent campaigns against the high land revenue demand of the British. In coastal Andhra and interior Tamil Nadu, liquor shops were picketed. In the Guntur district of Andhra Pradesh, rebels and poor peasants staged a number of forest satyagrahas, sometimes sending their cattle into forest without paying grazing fee. They were protesting because the colonial state had restricted their use of forest resources in various ways. They believed that Gandhiji would get their taxes reduced and have the forest regulations abolished. In many forest villages, peasants proclaimed Swaraj and believed that Gandhi Raj was about to be established. In Sindh, now in Pakistan, Muslim traders and peasants were very enthusiastic about the Khilafat call. In Bengal too, the Khilafat non-cooperation alliance gave enormous communal unity and strength to the national movement. In Punjab, the Akali agitation of the Sikhs sought to remove corrupt Mahants supported by the British from their Gurudwaras. This movement got closely identified with the non-cooperation movement. In Assam, tea garden laborers shouting Gandhi Maharaj Ki Jai demanded a big increase in their wages. They left the British-owned plantations amidst declarations that they were following Gandhiji's wish. Interestingly, in the Assamese Vaishnav songs of the period, the reference to Krishna was substituted by Gandhi Raj, the people's Mahatma. We can see from the above that sometimes people thought of Gandhiji as a kind of Masiha, as someone who could help them overcome their misery and poverty. Gandhiji wished to build class unity, not class conflict. Yet peasants could imagine that he would help them in their fight against zamindars, and agricultural laborers believed he would provide them land. At times, ordinary people credited Gandhiji with their own achievements. For instance, at the end of a powerful movement, peasants of Pratapgarh in the United Provinces, now Uttar Pradesh, managed to stop illegal eviction of tenants. But they felt it was Gandhiji who had won this demand for them. At other times, using Gandhiji's name, tribals and peasants undertook actions that did not conform to Gandhian ideals. The happenings of 1922 to 1929. Mahatma Gandhi, as you know, was against violent movements. He abruptly called off the non-cooperation movement when in February 1922, a crowd of peasants set fire to a police station in Chauri Chaura. 22 policemen were killed on that day. The peasants were provoked because the police had fired on their peaceful demonstration. Once the non-cooperation movement was over, Gandhiji's followers stressed that the Congress must undertake constructive work in the rural areas. Other leaders such as Chittaranjan Das and Motilal Nehru argued that the party should fight elections to the councils and enter them in order to influence government policies. Through sincere social work in villages in the mid-1920s, the Gandhians were able to extend their support base. This proved to be very useful in launching the civil disobedience movement in 1930. Two important developments of the mid-1920s were the formation of the Rashtriya Samsayak Sangh (RSS), a Hindu organization, and the Communist Party of India. These parties have held very different ideas about the kind of country India should be. Find out about their ideas with the help of your teacher. The revolutionary nationalist Bhagat Singh too was active in this period. The decade closed with the Congress resolving to fight for Purna Swaraj, complete independence, in 1929 under the presidency of Jawaharlal Nehru. Consequently, Independence Day was observed on 26 January 1930 all over the country. It takes a loud voice to make the deaf hear Inqilab Jindabad. Revolutionary nationalists such as Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, Sukhdev and others wanted to fight against the colonial rule and the rich exploiting classes through a revolution of workers and peasants. For this purpose, they founded the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association in 1928 at Firoz Shah Kotla in Delhi. On 17 December 1928, Bhagat Singh, Azad and Rajguru assassinated Saunders, a police officer who was involved in the Lathi charge that had caused the death of Lala Lajpat Rai. On 8 April 1929, Bhagat Singh and B.K. Dutt threw a bomb in the Central Legislative Assembly. The aim, as their leaflet explained, was not to kill but to make the deaf hear and to remind the foreign government of its callous exploitation. Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev and Rajguru were executed on March 23, 1931. Bhagat Singh's age at that time was only 23. The march to Dandi. Purna Swaraj would never come on its own. It had to be fought for. In 1930, Gandhiji declared that he would lead a march to break the salt law. According to this law, the state had a monopoly on the manufacture and the sale of salt. Mahatma Gandhi, along with other nationalists, reasoned that it was sinful to tax salt since it is such an essential item of our food. The Salt March related the general desire of freedom to a specific grievance shared by everybody and thus did not divide the rich and the poor. Gandhiji and his followers marched for over 240 miles from Sabarmati to the coastal town of Dandi, where they broke the government law by gathering natural salt found on the seashore and boiling sea water to produce salt. Peasants, tribals and women participated in large numbers. A business federation published a pamphlet on the salt issue. The government tries to crush the movement through brutal action against peaceful satyagrahis. Thousands were sent to jail. The combined struggles of the Indian people bore fruit when the Government of India Act of 1935 prescribed provincial autonomy, and the government announced elections to the provincial legislatures in 1937. The Congress formed governments in 7 out of 11 provinces. In September 1939, after 2 years of Congress rule in the provinces, the Second World War broke out. Critical of Hitler, Congress leaders were ready to support the British war effort, but in return they wanted that India be granted independence after the war. The British refused to concede the demand. The Congress ministries resigned in protest, quit India, and later Mahatma Gandhi decided to initiate a new phase of movement against the British in the middle of the Second World War. The British must quit India immediately. He told them to the people, he said, "Do or die in your effort to fight the British, but you must fight non-violently." Gandhiji and other leaders were jailed at once, but the movement spread. It especially attracted peasants and the youth who gave up their studies to join it. Communications and symbols of state authority were attacked all over the country. In many areas, the people set up their own governments. The first response of the British was severe repression. By the end of 1943, over 90,000 people were arrested and around 1,000 killed in police firing. In many areas, orders were given to machine gun crowds from aeroplanes. The rebellion, however, ultimately brought the Raj to its knees towards independence and partition. Meanwhile, in 1940, the Muslim League had moved a resolution demanding independent states For Muslims in the northwestern and western areas of the country, the resolution did not mention partition or Pakistan. Why did the League ask for an autonomous arrangement for the Muslims of the subcontinent? From the late 1930s, the League began viewing the Muslims as a separate nation from the Hindus. In developing this notion, it may have been influenced by the history of tension between some Hindu and Muslim groups in the 1920s and 1930s. More importantly, the provincial elections in 1937 seemed to have convinced the League that Muslims were a minority and they would always have to pay second fiddle in any democratic structure. It feared that Muslims may even go unrepresented. The Congress rejection of the League's desire to form a joint Congress-League government in the United Provinces in 1937 also annoyed the League. The Congress' failure to mobilize the Muslim masses in the 1930s allowed the League to widen its social support. It sought to enlarge its support in the early 1940s. When most Congress leaders were in jail at the end of the war in 1945, the British opened a negotiation between the Congress, the League and themselves for the independence of India. The talks failed because the League saw itself as the sole spokesperson of India's Muslims. The Congress could not accept this claim since a large number of Muslims still supported it. Elections to the provinces were again held in 1946. The Congress did well in the general constituencies, but the League's success in the seats reserved for Muslims was spectacular. It persisted with the demand for Pakistan. In March 1946, the British cabinet set a three-member mission to Delhi to examine this demand and to suggest a suitable political framework for a free India. This mission suggested that India should remain united and constitute itself as a loose confederation with some autonomy for Muslim majority areas, but it could not get the Congress and the Muslim League to agree to specific details of the proposals. Partition now became more or less inevitable. After the failure of the cabinet mission, the Muslim League decided on mass agitation for winning its Pakistan demand. It announced 16 August 1946 as Direct Action Day. On this day, riots broke out in Calcutta, lasting several days and resulting in the death of thousands of people. By March 1947, violence spread to different parts of northern India. Many 100,000 people were killed and numerous women had to face untold brutalities. During the partition, millions of people were forced to flee their homes. Torn asunder from their homelands, they were reduced to being refugees in alien lands. Partition also meant that India changed, many of its cities changed, and new country Pakistan was born. So the joy of our country's independence from British rule came mixed with the pain of violence of partition.